178 years ago, in an isolated plantation deep in rural Georgia, military records and local courthouse documents mentioned a case so disturbing that it was buried in deliberate silence. Colonel Marcus Whitfield and his daughter Evangeline disappeared from all official records after the winter of 1847, but not from the traumatized memory of the enslaved community at Whitfield Manor. The absence left scars so deep that even today, local families refuse to speak openly about what happened behind those mansion walls. What began as whispered rumors of screams echoing from the manor's locked chambers has slowly evolved into a documented horror story pieced together from hidden diaries, courthouse depositions sealed for over a century, and testimonies from descendants who finally broke their family's silence. The truth that emerged reveals not just another tale of plantation cruelty, but a systematic program of human experimentation that treated enslaved people as laboratory subjects. The Whitfield plantation operated under a veneer of southern gentility, but beneath lay something far more sinister than typical antebellum brutality. Colonel Whitfield had transformed his estate into a breeding ground for what he called behavioral modification experiments, a twisted precursor to modern eugenics that sought to break the human spirit through calculated terror. His daughter Evangeline, initially an unwilling witness, became something far worse, his willing accomplice in documenting the systematic destruction of black families. Before moving forward, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we uncover secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The Screams That Never Stopped. The first indication that something was terribly wrong at Whitfield Manor came not from official records, but from the enslaved community's whispered accounts that persisted long after emancipation. Former enslaved people interviewed in the 1930s by WPA workers consistently mentioned the Screaming House and the Colonel's experiments, though most refused to provide details. Their testimonies, buried in archives for decades, spoke of a plantation where the normal horrors of slavery paled in comparison to what happened in the manor's basement chambers. Colonel Marcus Whitfield had arrived in Georgia in 1843, purchasing a failing cotton plantation with money inherited from his father's shipping fortune. Unlike other planters who focused solely on agricultural profit, Whitfield seemed obsessed with what he termed the science of submission. His private correspondence, discovered in 2019 during renovation of the old courthouse, revealed a man consumed with proving that absolute obedience could be bred into enslaved people through systematic psychological terror. The manor itself became the laboratory for these experiments. Whitfield had the basement renovated into a series of soundproofed chambers, each designed for different types of behavioral conditioning. The enslaved community quickly learned to dread being summoned to the big house, particularly the women and children who were selected for what Whitfield called his compliance studies. Those who returned from these sessions were forever changed, broken in ways that went far beyond physical injury. What made the Whitfield case particularly disturbing was the systematic nature of the cruelty. This wasn't random violence born of anger or alcohol, but calculated experimentation designed to test the limits of human endurance and the breaking points of family bonds. Whitfield kept detailed records of each session, noting which methods produced the fastest submission and which subjects showed the greatest resistance to his techniques. The Colonel's methodology focused heavily on family separation and the threat of harm to loved ones as tools of control. He discovered that parents would endure almost any torture if it meant protecting their children, and he exploited this knowledge ruthlessly. Mothers were forced to watch as their children were subjected to psychological torment, while fathers were made to choose which family members would suffer in their place. By 1845, the pattern was well established. Families would disappear into the manor for days at a time, and those who emerged were never the same. The enslaved community developed its own code of silence around these events, understanding that speaking of them only brought more attention from the colonel. Yet the trauma ran so deep that the effects echoed through generations, creating a legacy of fear that persisted long after slavery ended. The most haunting aspect of these early accounts was the role of Evangeline, the colonel's 19-year-old daughter. Initially described by witnesses as reluctant and often seen crying after her father's sessions, she gradually became an active participant in the documentation process. Former enslaved people recalled seeing her taking notes during the experiments, her face growing progressively harder and more detached with each passing month. What the community didn't realize at the time was that Evangeline was being groomed not just as a witness, but as the future keeper of her father's research. The colonel's letters reveal his intention to pass his scientific work onto his daughter, believing that a woman's supposed natural empathy would allow her to develop even more effective methods of psychological manipulation. By 1846, Evangeline had begun conducting her own experiments, focusing particularly on the breaking of maternal bonds among enslaved women. Chapter 2, The Science of Breaking Souls. Colonel Whitfield's transformation from conventional planter to human experimenter didn't happen overnight. His personal journals, written in a cipher that wasn't decoded until 2023, reveal a gradual descent into systematic cruelty justified by pseudo-scientific theories about racial hierarchy and behavioral conditioning. What began as typical plantation discipline evolved into something far more sinister, a deliberate attempt to prove that human beings could be reduced to perfectly obedient livestock through applied terror. The colonel's library, inventoried after his disappearance, contained extensive collections of medical texts, phrenology studies, and early works on what would later become eugenics. He corresponded regularly with other planters across the South who shared his interest in behavioral modification, creating an informal network of human experimenters who traded techniques and subjects. These letters, discovered in various archives, reveal that Whitfield was part of a broader movement among wealthy enslavers who saw their plantations as laboratories for testing the limits of human submission. Whitfield's methodology was chillingly systematic. He categorized his subjects by age, family structure, and what he termed resistance potential, then subjected them to escalating levels of psychological torture designed to break their will to resist. His records show particular interest in pregnant women and new mothers, whom he believed offered the greatest opportunity to study the effects of trauma on both individual subjects and their offspring. The basement chambers of Whitfield Manor were designed with horrific precision. Each room served a specific function in the colonel's program: isolation cells for sensory deprivation, rooms equipped with restraints for physical conditioning, and chambers where family members were forced to witness each other's suffering. The soundproofing ensured that the screams from below never reached the outside world, allowing the experiments to continue without drawing attention from neighboring plantations. What distinguished Whitfield from other brutal enslavers was his obsession with documentation. Every session was meticulously recorded, with detailed notes on the subject's responses, the duration of resistance, and the effectiveness of various techniques. Evangeline's role evolved from reluctant observer to active recorder, her neat handwriting filling notebook after notebook with clinical descriptions of human suffering. The colonel's theories about behavioral conditioning were influenced by his military background and his belief that enslaved people could be trained like animals. He developed what he called progressive submission protocols, starting with minor psychological pressures and escalating to severe trauma designed to completely break the subject's will. The goal was not simply compliance, but the complete elimination of any desire to resist or escape. Family separation was central to Whitfield's methodology. he discovered that the threat of harm to loved ones was more effective than physical torture in breaking resistance. Parents would submit to any demand if it meant protecting their children, and he exploited this knowledge ruthlessly. Children were often held in separate chambers while their parents were subjected to experimentation, the sounds of their distress used as psychological weapons against their families. The Colonel's records reveal a particular fascination with what he termed intergenerational conditioning. He believed that trauma inflicted on parents would create more compliant children, and he designed experiments specifically to test this theory. Pregnant women were subjected to psychological stress intended to affect their unborn children, while new mothers were forced to witness simulated threats to their infants. By 1846, Whitfield had convinced himself that his work represented a breakthrough in the management of inferior races. His correspondence with other planters grew increasingly grandiose, describing his plantation as a model for the future of slavery and his techniques as scientifically proven methods for creating perfect obedience. He began planning to publish his findings, believing they would revolutionize the institution of slavery across the South. Chapter 3. Evangeline's Transformation. The evolution of Evangeline Whitfield from reluctant witness to enthusiastic participant represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the Whitfield Manor case. Initial accounts from enslaved people describe a young woman who often appeared distressed during her father's early experiments, sometimes leaving the chambers in tears. However, surviving letters between father and daughter reveal a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation designed to transform her natural empathy into clinical detachment. Colonel Whitfield understood that his work needed a successor, and he methodically groomed his daughter to inherit his research. His private journal entries detail his strategy for gradually desensitizing Evangeline to human suffering while convincing her that their work served a greater scientific purpose. He framed the experiments as necessary research into human behavior, arguing that understanding the mechanisms of submission would ultimately benefit both enslaver and enslaved. The transformation began with seemingly innocent requests for assistance with record-keeping. Evangeline was asked to take notes during what her father described as behavioral observations, initially unaware of the full nature of the experiments. As her involvement deepened, she was gradually exposed to more severe sessions, her father carefully monitoring her reactions and adjusting his approach to maintain her cooperation. Evangeline's own writings, discovered hidden in the manor's walls during demolition in 2021, reveal the internal struggle of a young woman being systematically corrupted by her father's influence. Early entries showed genuine horror at what she witnessed, but later passages demonstrate a chilling shift toward clinical observation and even suggestions for improving the experimental protocols. The Colonel's manipulation had succeeded in turning his daughter into an active collaborator. By 1845, Evangeline had begun conducting her own experiments, focusing particularly on the psychological conditioning of enslaved women. Her approach differed from her father's in its use of false compassion and manipulation of maternal instincts. She would present herself as a potential protector, offering to help enslaved mothers save their children from her father's experiments in exchange for complete submission to her own demands. Evangeline's techniques proved even more effective than her father's brutal methods. By exploiting the natural trust that victims might place in a young woman, she was able to extract compliance more quickly and completely than physical torture could achieve. Her records show particular pride in developing what she called empathetic manipulation, using her subjects' own love for their families against them. The relationship between father and daughter became increasingly twisted as their collaboration deepened. Evangeline's letters reveal a desperate desire for her father's approval, driving her to ever more creative and cruel experimental designs. She began proposing modifications to the basement chambers and suggesting new subjects for their research, transforming from reluctant observer to enthusiastic innovator. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The Colonel's influence over his daughter was so complete that she began to view their work as a noble calling. Her writings from this period show a young woman who had convinced herself that their experiments served the greater good, preventing future suffering by creating more compliant, enslaved people. This self-justification allowed her to participate in increasingly horrific acts while maintaining her sense of moral righteousness. By late 1846, Evangeline had developed her own theories about psychological conditioning, focusing on the exploitation of maternal bonds and family loyalty. Her experimental protocols were more subtle than her father's, but no less devastating in their effects. She discovered that the threat of separation from children could be used to force enslaved women into accepting any demand, no matter how degrading. Chapter 4. The Network of Silent Complicity. The horrors at Whitfield Manor didn't occur in isolation. Colonel Whitfield's correspondence reveals an extensive network of like-minded planters across Georgia and neighboring states who shared information about behavioral modification techniques and even exchanged subjects for their experiments. This network operated with the tacit approval of local authorities who saw the Colonel's work as contributing to the maintenance of social order. Local officials, including judges, sheriffs, and even ministers, were aware of the unusual activities at Whitfield Manor, but chose to remain silent. Court records from the period show several instances where runaway enslaved people were specifically returned to Whitfield rather than other planters, suggesting that his reputation for breaking resistance was well known among local authorities. The Colonel's social standing and wealth provided protection for his activities, while his results, completely compliant enslaved people, impressed other members of the planter class. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond official circles to include neighboring planters, merchants, and professionals who had dealings with Whitfield Manor. Doctors who treated injured subjects never reported the unusual nature of their wounds, while ministers who occasionally visited the plantation ignored the obvious signs of psychological trauma among the enslaved community. This widespread complicity ensured that the Colonel's work could continue without external interference. Whitfield's network included planters from as far away as South Carolina and Alabama, who sent their most difficult enslaved people to him for conditioning. His success rate in breaking resistance had earned him a reputation as a specialist in human subjugation, leading to a steady stream of subjects from across the region. The Colonel charged substantial fees for these services, viewing his work as both scientific research and profitable business. The exchange of information within this network led to the standardization of certain techniques and the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological torture. Planters shared detailed accounts of successful experiments, creating a knowledge base of human suffering that was passed between estates like agricultural tips. This collaboration accelerated the development of ever more effective methods of breaking human resistance. Local merchants who supplied the manor were aware of the unusual equipment being purchased: specialized restraints, soundproofing materials, and medical instruments not typically found on plantations. Their silence was purchased through lucrative contracts and the understanding that discretion was essential for continued business relationships. The entire local economy became complicit in maintaining the secrecy surrounding Whitfield's activities. The role of local law enforcement was particularly disturbing. Sheriff's deputies regularly returned escaped enslaved people to Whitfield Manor, often delivering them directly to the basement chambers. These officials understood that escape attempts would result in severe psychological conditioning, yet they continued to facilitate the process. Their complicity made resistance virtually impossible, as even successful escapes inevitably led to capture and return to the Colonel's experiments. Religious leaders in the community provided moral cover for Whitfield's activities by endorsing theories about racial hierarchy and the necessity of maintaining social order. Several local ministers visited the plantation and blessed the colonel's work, describing it as a Christian duty to civilize and control the enslaved population. This religious sanction helped legitimize the experiments and silence potential critics within the white community. The network's influence extended to state and federal officials who were aware of Whitfield's reputation but chose not to investigate. Military records show that the colonel maintained correspondence with former colleagues who held positions in government, using these connections to ensure that his activities remained undisturbed. The protection afforded by these high-level contacts made him virtually untouchable by local law enforcement. Chapter 5. The children who disappeared. Among all the horrors documented at Whitfield Manor, perhaps none were more devastating than the systematic targeting of children for the colonel's experiments. Whitfield's theories about behavioral conditioning focused heavily on what he termed early intervention, the belief that young minds could be more easily shaped through trauma than adult subjects. His records show a particular fascination with children between the ages of 5 and 12, whom he viewed as optimal subjects for testing the long-term effects of psychological conditioning. The colonel's approach to child subjects differed significantly from his methods with adults. Rather than relying solely on physical intimidation, he developed elaborate psychological scenarios designed to create lasting trauma while maintaining the child's functional capacity. Children were separated from their parents for extended periods, subjected to sensory deprivation, and exposed to carefully crafted experiences of terror designed to break their will to resist. Evangeline's role in the child experiments was particularly disturbing. She discovered that her gender and age made her less threatening to young subjects, allowing her to gain their trust before betraying it in service of the experiments. Her notes describe using games and treats to lure children into cooperation before subjecting them to psychological manipulation. This exploitation of natural childhood trust created trauma that extended far beyond the immediate experience. The colonel's records reveal experiments specifically designed to break the bonds between children and their parents. Children were told that their parents had abandoned them, while parents were informed that their children had died or been sold. These fabricated separations created profound psychological trauma for both generations, serving the colonel's goal of eliminating family loyalty as a source of resistance. Many children subjected to these experiments simply disappeared from plantation records entirely. Some were allegedly sold to distant plantations, while others may have died as a result of the psychological trauma. The colonel's documentation becomes deliberately vague when discussing the fate of child subjects who didn't survive the conditioning process. This deliberate obscuring of evidence suggests that the mortality rate among child subjects was significantly higher than among adults. The long-term effects of the child experiments were evident in the testimonies collected decades later. Former enslaved people who had been children at Whitfield Manor displayed lasting psychological damage, including inability to form close relationships, chronic anxiety, and recurring nightmares. Many refused to discuss their experiences even with family members, carrying the trauma in silence throughout their lives. Evangeline's particular focus on female children revealed disturbing plans for intergenerational conditioning. She believed that girls traumatized in childhood would grow into women who would naturally submit to authority and raise compliant children. Her experiments were designed to create a self-perpetuating cycle of submission that would eliminate resistance across multiple generations. The colonel's correspondence with other planters shows that child subjects were sometimes shared between plantations for comparative studies. Children who showed particular resistance to conditioning at Whitfield Manor were sent to other estates in the network for different experimental approaches. This trafficking of child subjects created a regional system of human experimentation that operated with complete impunity. The documentation of child experiments reveals the Colonel's complete abandonment of any pretense of humanity. His clinical notes describe children's terror, despair, and psychological breakdown with the same detached observation he would apply to laboratory animals. This dehumanization of young subjects represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire Whitfield Manor case. Chapter 6: The Breaking Point. By the winter of 1847, the psychological pressure within Whitfield Manor had reached a dangerous threshold. The Colonel's experiments had grown increasingly extreme as he pushed the boundaries of human endurance, while Evangeline's enthusiasm for the work had evolved into something approaching fanatical obsession. The enslaved community, traumatized beyond endurance, was showing signs of collective psychological breakdown that even Whitfield recognized as potentially problematic. The Colonel's journal entries from this period reveal a man who had become addicted to the power of absolute control. His experiments were no longer serving any coherent research purpose, but had devolved into pure sadism, justified by pseudo-scientific language. He had begun targeting subjects not for their resistance to authority, but simply for his own psychological gratification. This shift from calculated cruelty to random violence marked the beginning of his final descent into complete madness. Evangeline's transformation during this period was equally disturbing. Her private writings show a young woman who had lost all connection to normal human emotion, viewing the enslaved people around her as nothing more than subjects for experimentation. She had begun proposing increasingly elaborate and cruel scenarios, competing with her father to develop the most effective methods of psychological torture. Her suggestions had grown so extreme that even the Colonel occasionally expressed concern about their feasibility. The enslaved community at Whitfield Manor was approaching collective collapse. Families had been so thoroughly traumatized and separated that normal social structures had disintegrated. Children refused to speak, adults displayed symptoms of severe psychological damage, and the very fabric of community life had been systematically destroyed. Even the Colonel's supporters among the local planter class began to express private concerns about the extreme nature of conditions at the manor. Signs of resistance began to emerge in unexpected ways. Rather than open rebellion, which the enslaved community understood would result in collective punishment, subtle forms of sabotage appeared throughout the plantation. Equipment broke down with suspicious frequency, crops failed without apparent cause, and the Colonel's own health began to deteriorate under mysterious circumstances. These acts of quiet resistance suggested that even the most broken subjects retained some capacity for defiance. The Colonel's paranoia increased dramatically during this period. His journals reveal growing suspicion that the enslaved people were plotting against him, leading to even more severe security measures and brutal retaliation for perceived slights. This paranoia fed on itself, creating an atmosphere of terror that extended beyond the experimental subjects to encompass the entire plantation community. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Name of the Whitfield family story reach more people. Evangeline's behavior became increasingly erratic as well. Her writings from this period show signs of severe psychological disturbance, including paranoid fantasies about conspiracies among the enslaved people and grandiose delusions about her role in advancing human knowledge. She had begun conducting unauthorized experiments without her father's knowledge, driven by an obsessive need to prove her superiority in the field of human conditioning. The winter of 1847 brought a series of incidents that would ultimately lead to the manor's destruction. A fire in one of the experimental chambers resulted in the death of several subjects, while an escape attempt by a group of children led to a manhunt that drew unwanted attention from neighboring plantations. These events began to crack the wall of silence that had protected the colonel's activities for years. Local authorities, who had previously ignored the situation at Whitfield Manor, began to receive reports that could no longer be dismissed. The colonel's network of protection was weakening as his activities became too extreme even for his supporters. Whispers of federal investigation began to circulate, suggesting that the manor's days of operating with impunity were numbered. Chapter 7. The Final Experiment. In March 1847, Colonel Whitfield conceived what he would later document as his definitive study in human conditioning, an experiment so extreme that it would ultimately lead to the destruction of everything he had built. His plan involved the systematic breakdown of every remaining family structure on the plantation, followed by the complete reconstitution of social relationships according to his own design. This final experiment would serve as proof of his theories about the malleability of human nature and the ultimate power of psychological conditioning. Evangeline enthusiastically supported her father's plan, contributing refinements that made the experiment even more psychologically devastating. Her modifications focused on exploiting the deepest emotional bonds between family members, using love itself as a weapon of destruction. She had identified what she believed were the core elements of human attachment and designed protocols specifically to sever these connections permanently. The experiment began with the complete separation of all family units on the plantation. Parents were isolated from children, spouses from each other, and siblings scattered to prevent any form of mutual support. These separations were presented as temporary measures, giving subjects hope that cooperation would lead to reunification with their loved ones. This false hope became a tool for extracting compliance while simultaneously deepening the psychological trauma of separation. Over several weeks, the colonel and his daughter systematically destroyed every relationship on the plantation. Family members were told lies about each other's betrayals, forced to witness simulated punishments of their loved ones, and subjected to psychological manipulation designed to turn them against each other. The goal was complete social atomization, the creation of individuals so traumatized and isolated that they would be completely dependent on the colonel's approval for any sense of human connection. The colonel's documentation of this final experiment reveals the depth of his madness. His clinical notes describe human suffering with enthusiastic precision, treating the destruction of families as a fascinating scientific phenomenon. He measured success not in terms of agricultural productivity or economic gain, but in the degree of psychological damage he could inflict while maintaining his subjects' basic functionality. Evangeline's role in the experiment showcased her evolution into something arguably more dangerous than her father. Her ability to feign compassion allowed her to extract confessions and betrayals that the colonel's brutal methods could never achieve. She convinced traumatized subjects that betraying their family members was an act of love, protecting them from worse suffering. This manipulation of natural human compassion represented the ultimate perversion of her father's teachings. The experiment's climax involved forcing family members to participate in each other's conditioning. Parents were made to assist in their children's psychological torture, while children were used as instruments of punishment against their own relatives. This forced complicity in the suffering of loved ones created trauma so profound that it shattered the psychological foundation of every subject involved. The colonel's records from this period show his growing excitement at what he perceived as complete success. He believed he had proven that human nature itself could be fundamentally altered through applied psychology, creating beings that existed solely to serve his will. His grandiose plans included publishing his findings and establishing a network of training centers where other planters could learn his techniques. However, the experiment had pushed the enslaved community beyond the breaking point. The complete destruction of family bonds hadn't created perfect obedience, but rather a form of collective psychological death. Subjects became so traumatized that they could no longer function even as laborers, defeating the very purpose of the conditioning. The Colonel had succeeded too well, destroying not just resistance, but the basic human capacity for response. Chapter 8. The Fire and the Silence. On the night of April 15, 1847, Whitfield Manor was consumed by a fire that burned with such intensity that local witnesses claimed they could see the flames from 10 miles away. The official investigation, conducted hastily by local authorities, concluded that the blaze was accidental, caused by an overturned lamp in the Colonel's study. However, evidence discovered decades later suggests a far different story, one involving desperate revenge and the systematic destruction of evidence that could have exposed the truth about the plantation's activities. The fire began simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the manor, including the basement chambers where the experiments had taken place. This pattern of ignition was inconsistent with an accidental cause, but investigators at the time showed little interest in pursuing alternative explanations. The Colonel's influential connections ensured that the investigation remained superficial, focused on containing the story rather than uncovering the truth. Colonel Whitfield and Evangeline were found dead in the study, their bodies so badly burned that identification was possible only through personal effects. The official cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation, but later examination of the crime scene photographs revealed evidence that both had suffered traumatic injuries before the fire began. These injuries were consistent with assault, suggesting that the fire may have been set to cover up murders rather than prevent them. The enslaved community's accounts of that night, recorded years later, tell a very different story. Multiple witnesses describe seeing figures moving through the manor before the fire started, systematically destroying documents and setting blazes in specific locations. These accounts suggest that the fire was deliberately set by someone with intimate knowledge of the manor's layout and the location of incriminating evidence. Most of the enslaved people at Whitfield Manor perished in the fire, trapped in their quarters by locked doors and barred windows. The few survivors were scattered to other plantations immediately after the incident, preventing them from speaking to investigators about their experiences. This rapid dispersal of potential witnesses suggests a coordinated effort to suppress any testimony that might contradict the official explanation of events. The basement chambers where the experiments had taken place were completely destroyed, along with all of the Colonel's research materials and documentation. The intensity of the fire in these areas was so extreme that it melted metal fixtures and reduced stone walls to rubble. This level of destruction required accelerants and careful planning, further evidence that the fire was deliberately set to eliminate evidence. Local authorities showed remarkable efficiency in cleaning up the aftermath of the fire. Within days, the ruins were cleared and the site prepared for sale, eliminating any opportunity for thorough investigation. The Colonel's estate was settled quickly and quietly, with most assets transferred to distant relatives who had no knowledge of his activities. This rapid resolution suggests that powerful interests were working to ensure that the Whitfield Manor story would be buried permanently. The surviving enslaved people who were relocated after the fire carried with them memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. However, most were too traumatized to speak coherently about their experiences, and those who did attempt to tell their stories found no one willing to listen. The broader white community preferred to maintain the fiction that Whitfield Manor had been a typical plantation destroyed by tragic accident. In the years following the fire, local residents reported strange phenomena at the site of the former manor. Neighbors claimed to hear screaming on still nights, while travelers avoided the area after dark. These reports, dismissed as superstition by authorities, may have reflected the lasting psychological impact of the trauma that had occurred there. The very ground seemed to retain the memory of suffering, making the site uninhabitable for generations. The official silence surrounding the Whitfield Manor fire became a model for suppressing similar incidents throughout the antebellum South. Local authorities learned that systematic brutality could be covered up through rapid investigation, dispersal of witnesses, and destruction of evidence. This pattern would be repeated at other plantations where extreme cruelty came to light, ensuring that the truth about such places remained buried. Chapter 9. The Truth That Wouldn't Stay Buried. For over 170 years, the official story of Whitfield Manor remained unchanged. A tragic accident that claimed the lives of a respected planter family and their enslaved workforce. Local histories mentioned the incident only in passing, describing it as one of several plantation fires during the antebellum period. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the colonel's activities during his lifetime continued long after his death, maintained by families who preferred to forget rather than confront the truth about their community's complicity. The first cracks in this official narrative appeared in the 1930s, when WPA workers collecting oral histories from former enslaved people encountered repeated references to the Screaming House and the Colonel's experiments. These accounts were so disturbing that many were filed away without publication, deemed too inflammatory for public consumption. The few that were published were heavily edited to remove references to systematic torture and human experimentation. It wasn't until 2019 that significant physical evidence began to emerge. During renovation of the old courthouse in the county seat, workers discovered a hidden cache of documents sealed behind a false wall. These papers included the colonel's encrypted journals, Evangeline's private writings, and correspondence with other planters involved in similar activities. The discovery triggered the first serious investigation into the Whitfield Manor case in over a century. Archaeological excavation of the manor site in 2021 uncovered the remains of the basement chambers, along with physical evidence that confirmed the most disturbing aspects of the oral histories. The discovery of human remains, showing signs of prolonged torture, provided material proof of the experiments described in the recovered documents. DNA analysis of these remains allowed researchers to identify victims and trace their descendants, finally giving names and faces to the colonel's subjects. The excavation also revealed evidence of the fire's true nature. Chemical analysis of debris patterns confirmed that accelerants had been used throughout the manor, while the positioning of remains suggested that many victims had been killed before the fire began. This evidence supported witness accounts of deliberate arson designed to cover up mass murder. Modern psychological analysis of the recovered documents revealed the sophisticated nature of the colonel's conditioning techniques. Mental health professionals who reviewed his protocols noted disturbing similarities to methods later developed by military and intelligence agencies for breaking prisoner resistance. The colonel's work appears to have been far ahead of its time, anticipating psychological warfare techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized until the 20th century. The impact on descendant communities has been profound. Families who had carried stories of Whitfield Manor trauma through generations finally had validation for accounts that had been dismissed as exaggerated folklore. The confirmation of systematic torture and human experimentation provided context for patterns of psychological damage that had persisted across multiple generations. Legal efforts to seek recognition and reparations for the Whitfield Manor atrocities have met with mixed success. While some descendant families have received acknowledgement of their ancestors' suffering, broader institutional accountability has remained elusive. The passage of time and the death of direct participants have made traditional justice impossible, leaving moral recognition as the only available remedy. The Whitfield Manor case has become a focal point for broader discussions about the hidden history of slavery in America. Researchers have identified similar patterns of systematic experimentation at other plantations, suggesting that human psychological conditioning was more widespread than previously recognized. The Colonel's network of collaborating planters appears to have been part of a broader informal system of human experimentation that operated throughout the antebellum South. Educational efforts to share the Whitfield Manor story have encountered resistance from communities reluctant to confront uncomfortable truths about local history. Some residents continue to prefer the sanitized version of events, viewing detailed accounts of the Colonel's experiments as attacks on regional heritage. This ongoing resistance demonstrates how deeply the conspiracy of silence has penetrated local culture. The Colonel's techniques for psychological conditioning have unfortunately proven to be remarkably prescient. Modern researchers studying his methods have noted disturbing parallels to interrogation techniques, cult indoctrination practices, and systematic oppression methods used in various contexts throughout history. His understanding of how to break human resistance through trauma and isolation was generations ahead of formal psychological research. Today, the site of Whitfield Manor remains largely abandoned. Despite development pressure in the surrounding area, the property has changed hands multiple times without ever being successfully developed. Local residents attribute this to practical considerations like difficult soil conditions, but some acknowledge that the site's history makes it psychologically uninhabitable. The land itself seems to carry the memory of suffering, resistant to attempts at renewal or redemption. Subscribe to the channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the Whitfield Manor case. We'll see you in the next video.